the forgotten normal of medieval life. Tonight, we begin where history books rarely linger, not with kings, battles, or shining armor, but with the quiet, awkward, deeply human details of medieval life. The things so ordinary at the time that nobody thought they were worth recording, which, frankly, was inconsiderate of them. So before we settle in, dim the lights. Let the background hum of a fan or a distant night breeze soften the room. This is not a story of heroes. It's a story of people, tired, practical, and doing their best in a world that rarely cooperated. One of the most persistent myths about medieval people is that they stayed in one place their entire lives. Born in one village, married in the same church, buried a few steps away. A peaceful, rooted existence centered around the same patch of land and the same familiar cow. Reality disagreed. Medieval life was not stationary. It was a low-energy migration system fueled by misfortune. People moved constantly, not because they were adventurous, but because something had gone wrong. Crops failed. Lords raised rents. Armies passed through and consumed everything edible, leaving behind trampled fields and silence. Complaining was dangerous. So people packed up whatever wasn't nailed down, debated whether the cooking pot was worth carrying, and walked, not toward opportunity, but toward the hope that somewhere else might be slightly less cursed. Seasonal labor added to the movement. Harvests pulled workers across entire regions. Religious festivals triggered mass migrations, with thousands of people deciding that walking for weeks just to stand in a field and pray was a reasonable vacation plan. Pilgrimages were popular because nothing builds spiritual character quite like blistered feet and food poisoning. Travel itself was an endurance test. Roads were mud. In winter, you sank. In summer, you choked on dust. Signposts were rare. Maps were optimistic lies. Getting lost wasn't a mistake. It was the default setting. And yet people kept moving because staying could be worse. If your lord suddenly remembered you existed and wanted more taxes, leaving quietly at night might save your life. Villages became revolving doors. New faces arrived. Old ones disappeared. Nobody asked questions, because tomorrow they might be the ones leaving with a sack of grain and a growing sense of regret. Even news traveled informally. Gossip moved faster than official messages. A loud merchant with flexible morals could spread rumors across half a kingdom faster than a royal messenger who actually knew what he was doing. Medieval people weren't static peasants frozen in time. They were mobile survivors, constantly walking away from problems, usually straight into new ones. Romance in this world was heartfelt, emotional, and frequently outsourced. Literacy was rare and expensive. Most people couldn't write their own names, let alone pour their feelings onto parchment. So when medieval people wanted to express love, devotion, or longing, they hired a professional, a scribe, a clerk, sometimes a monk. Nothing sets the mood like confessing your deepest feelings to a man sworn to celibacy who is quietly judging your sentence structure. Love letters followed strict formats. Opening praises, dramatic metaphors, vows of loyalty. If you struggled, the scribe helped. Would you like to compare her beauty to the dawn, the rose, or divine light? Romance had rules. And anonymity was impossible. The scribe probably knew both of you, your families, and the inconvenient fact that one of you was already engaged. Delivery was risky. Letters traveled by friends, messengers, or anyone who owed you a favor. Wax seals offered hope, not privacy. Anyone could read your romantic desperation for entertainment. And yet it worked. People married. Hearts broke. Love survived quills, witnesses, reused metaphors, and monks with opinions. Romance wasn't private, but it was sincere. In medieval society, being left-handed was not a harmless quirk. It was suspicious. The Latin word for left, sinister, set the tone. Right was righteous. Left was chaotic. Children were trained out of left-handedness early. Favoring your left wasn't preference, it was defiance, possibly demonic. Even rituals reinforced this. Oaths were sworn with the right hand. Blessings were given with the right. Important actions happened on the right side. Medieval logic concluded that if the devil existed, and everyone agreed he did, he probably preferred the left. Left-handed knights confused opponents, which sounds useful until your instructors decided unpredictability was suspicious. Medical theory didn't help either. The right side of the body was considered strong and noble, the left side weak and imbalanced. Still, left-handed people survived. They adapted. Many switched hands in public and reverted in private, medieval code switching, but for limbs. Self-awareness existed in the Middle Ages. Self-reflection did not, at least not visually. Mirrors were rare, expensive, and impractical. Most peasants lived their entire lives without ever clearly seeing their own faces. Polished metal mirrors existed, but they distorted your reflection into something vaguely haunted. Water served as the closest alternative. Wells, ponds, buckets. You glanced briefly, accepted whatever shape stared back, and moved on. Falling in was a real possibility. As a result, medieval people learned what they looked like through commentary. Brutal, public commentary. You have your father's nose. You look tired. This was your mirror. Grooming was approximate. Hairstyles were practical. Beards were trimmed by feel. If something looked wrong, someone would eventually announce it loudly. Confidence was easier when you had no visual proof otherwise. In a world without mirrors, self-esteem was built on survival, not selfies. And, honestly, that might be the most medieval flex of all. One of the strangest truths about medieval life is how emotionally attached people were to their possessions. Not because they loved objects, but because they depended on them. Most people owned very little. And what they owned, they kept for life. Naturally, those objects acquired personalities. Tools were named. A shovel wasn't just a shovel. It was the shovel. The one that dug fields, survived winters, buried relatives, and occasionally threatened geese. When something performs that much emotional labor, it earns a name. Weapons were especially personal. Swords weren't metal. They were companions. Breaking one wasn't inconvenient. It was tragic. People didn't say, "My sword broke." They said, "I lost him." Even ovens, doors, and bells were named. If an object was central to survival, it crossed from tool to relationship. This wasn't superstition. It was exhaustion mixed with practicality. When your entire life depended on a handful of items working properly, you talked to them, blamed them, thanked them. Shoes were survival equipment. Most people owned exactly one pair. Leather was expensive. Labor was expensive. Shoes endured mud, frost, heat, animal waste, and medieval street liquids nobody explained. Shoes were repaired endlessly. Stitched, patched, reinforced until they were more artifact than footwear. Cobblers were essential. A good one could extend a shoe's life for decades. Shoes appeared in wills. Parents passed them down. Breaking in new shoes hurt because they weren't new. They were someone else's. Losing a shoe in winter wasn't annoying. It was dangerous. Bare feet on frozen ground meant injury or death. People walked carefully, deliberately. You didn't run unless chased by something worse than losing footwear. Worn shoes weren't signs of poverty. They were signs of responsibility. One quiet fear haunted medieval life more than death, being forgotten. In a world without photographs or recordings, memory was fragile. If no one remembered you, it was as if you had never existed. This is why names mattered. Children were named after relatives. Naming wasn't creative, it was archival. Gravestones mattered deeply. Even a scratch symbol declared, "I was here." If stone wasn't affordable, stories carried memory. Events were public. Contracts spoken aloud. Witnesses mattered. Privacy wasn't romantic, it was risky. Being seen meant being remembered. Even charity came with a request. Say my name in your prayers. That wasn't vanity. It was insurance. Silence terrified medieval people. Noise meant life. Silence meant illness, death, or something unseen. Churches rang bells constantly. Homes were filled with talking, praying, singing. Even alone. Sound pushed back the unknown. At night, silence was especially dangerous. Darkness already belonged to spirits. A crackling fire wasn't just warmth, it was reassurance. Hair carried meaning. Long hair signaled power or rebellion. Women's loose hair was considered dangerous. Criminals had their hair cut as punishment. It wasn't cosmetic, it was identity theft. Hair was guarded carefully. Strands could be used in charms or curses. Losing hair wasn't trivial, it was risky. Even days were judged. Some days were blessed. Others were cursed. Calendars dictated when to marry, travel, plant crops, or bleed patients. Doing something important on the wrong day meant disaster was your fault. Sneezing was a spiritual emergency. A sneeze meant your soul briefly losing grip. Blessings weren't polite. They were protective seals. A sneeze without a blessing was alarming. Childhood was brief. As soon as a child could walk safely, they worked. Childhood wasn't innocence. It was preparation. A useful child was a protected child. And through all of this movement, fear, labor, superstition, medieval people endured. They didn't chase comfort. They chased survival. They didn't seek fame. They sought remembrance. And the fact that we're still talking about them now means somehow they won. In the medieval world, identity did not live in ink. It lived in memory, recognition, and trust. Most people could not read. Many could not write. And yet society functioned. Contracts were made. Property changed hands. Promises were enforced. Not through signatures, but through symbols. When peasants, craftsmen, or merchants needed to confirm an agreement, they did not sign their name. They made a mark. Often it was a simple cross. Sometimes a line. Sometimes a shape used consistently throughout their life. That mark was not decoration. It was identity. It said, "This is me." And once placed on a document, it carried legal weight equal to any written name. The contract itself was usually read aloud by a clerk. The words flowed formally, confidently, often faster than understanding aloud. Everyone nodded. Everyone agreed. Or at least pretended to. Then the mark was made. And hope took over. Hope that the man holding the parchment was honest. Hope that land, livestock, or livelihood was not quietly transferred away under a veil of ceremony. These symbols were not random. They became personal. Familiar marks inspired trust. An unfamiliar or shaky one raised suspicion. Forging a mark was a crime, even when that mark was nothing more than a crooked line. That alone reveals how much value medieval society placed on recognition over literacy. Visual language held everything together. Shop signs followed the same logic. Since customers could not read names, businesses announced themselves through images. A boot meant a cobbler. A key meant a locksmith. A barrel meant a tavern. You did not need letters. You needed memory. Even noble families relied on symbols. Coats of arms, crests, and seals were not decorative traditions. They were legal tools. A wax seal stamped with a family emblem validated documents without requiring a single word to be read. Breaking the seal broke trust. This system worked because medieval society was built on witnesses, reputation, and shared understanding. Identity was not spelled out. It was shown. And then there was death. Death in the medieval world was common, but certainty was rare. Medical knowledge was limited. Tools were crude. Diagnosis was simple. If someone stopped moving, breathing shallowly, or responding, the conclusion was often made quickly. And sometimes it was wrong. Comas, fainting, hypothermia, shock, and illness could all mimic death. During plagues, winters, and famines, bodies had to be dealt with quickly. Mistakes happened. Stories spread. Coffins reopened with scratch marks inside. Bodies found twisted, moved, or clearly panicked. Whether every story was true didn't matter. The fear was real. Being buried alive became one of medieval society's quiet obsessions. Wakes were not only social rituals. They were observation periods. Bodies were watched. If someone moved, twitched, or made a sound, relief followed. You were not dead yet. Some people requested delayed burials. Others asked to be buried with objects. Bells, ropes, signals. The idea of escape, however unlikely, mattered. Graves were shallow. Coffins were simple. Sometimes bodies were buried directly in the ground. Horrifying, yes, but at least theoretically survivable. Religion intensified the fear. Being buried alive was not just physical terror. It meant dying without confession, without last prayers, without spiritual closure. That risk haunted people more than pain itself. Medieval people did not fear death alone. They feared premature certainty. They feared silence mistaken for stillness, sleep mistaken for eternity. And yet, life continued. Despite danger, hardship, and fear, medieval life was not a constant tragedy. Most days were ordinary. People laughed. They joked. They complained loudly about neighbors, prices, weather, and authority. Humor was blunt and unfiltered. Manuscripts were filled with crude doodles, absurd creatures, and jokes that still feel shockingly modern. Festivals interrupted labor. Saints' days, feast days, market days, any excuse to stop working and eat badly was embraced. People danced poorly, sang loudly, mocked authority just carefully enough to survive. Absurdity became survival. When the world offers little certainty, humor fills the gaps. Medieval people were not foolish. They were adaptive. They found meaning in ritual, comfort in repetition, and relief in nonsense. History remembers plagues and wars. Medieval people remembered laughter, beauty, power, and the silent burden of being seen. In Tudor England, beauty was never personal. It was public, evaluated, enforced. A woman's appearance was not self-expression. It was evidence. Evidence of obedience, virtue, class, and control. Pale skin sat at the top of the hierarchy. Fairness suggested indoor life, distance from labor, and protection. Dark skin implied work, independence, and exposure. The sun belonged to peasants. Noble women avoided it through veils, powders, and clothing that turned pallor into status. Strength had to be hidden. A woman could be capable, but she could not appear capable. Softness mattered. Delicacy signaled virtue. Robustness suggested danger. Silence completed the image. Silence completed the image. The ideal woman spoke little, smiled carefully, and never appeared ambitious. Wit was admired in men and tolerated in queens. In ordinary women, it was risky. A sharp tongue suggested a sharp will. Chastity extended beyond behavior. It lived in posture, laughter, eye contact, and expression. A woman who smiled too freely could lose her reputation without accusation ever being spoken. Beauty was a responsibility, not a gift. Cosmetics revealed the contradiction. Women were expected to look flawless and condemned for using anything that helped them achieve it. Pale skin was enhanced with powders made from chalk, lead, and vinegar. These substances poisoned slowly, loosening teeth and damaging skin. Still, the risk was accepted. Visible decay was preferable to visible imperfection. Hair was another battlefield. Fair hair symbolized innocence. Women lightened it with herbs and chemicals, often destroying it. Wigs were common but denied. Illusion mattered more than truth. The fear surrounding cosmetics was fear of deception. A painted face was thought to mislead men, distort hierarchy, and threaten order. A woman who looked younger, healthier, or more fertile than reality allowed was seen as dangerous. And yet, refusing cosmetics carried its own punishment. Beauty had to look effortless, even when it required labor and pain. Marriage turned appearance into currency. Youth promised fertility and obedience. Age reduced value. Girls were married early. Love rarely mattered. Dowries could compensate for plain looks, but beauty amplified wealth dramatically. Once married, beauty remained an obligation. A wife was expected to remain attractive to secure affection and loyalty. Decline invited comparison, humiliation, or abandonment. For queens, the pressure was absolute. A queen's body was political property. Weight, illness, and aging were read as signs of fertility or failure. And Boleyn's appearance became evidence against her. Catherine of Aragon's aging body became a justification for removal. Elizabeth I controlled her image obsessively, turning beauty into symbol rather than vulnerability. Aging terrified Tudor society. Men aged into authority. Women aged into suspicion. Wrinkles, thinning hair, and decay were seen as failure, not time. Older women used cosmetics not for vanity but survival. The illusion of youth delayed disappearance. Beauty attracted admiration and suspicion. At court, beauty meant visibility. Visibility meant power. Power meant danger. Women learned to minimize praise, deflect attention, and mask confidence as humility. Yet within limits, women resisted. Clothing became coded language. Cosmetics became control. Silence became strategy. Influence moved quietly through timing and appearance rather than authority. Beauty was currency and cage. It offered access but demanded constant performance. It elevated women only while serving male control. Once it failed, there was rarely an alternative source of value. Tudor beauty was not created for women. It measured male authority. A well-presented woman implied a well-controlled household. A visible woman threatened order. Despite this, women navigated the system with intelligence and restraint. Resistance was rarely loud. It lived in fabric, gesture, timing, and restraint. Beauty never freed women, but used carefully, it sometimes protected them. Roman wine, power, discipline, and civilization in a cup. For the Romans, wine was not a luxury reserved for celebration. It was woven into daily life, ritual, medicine, and identity. Soldiers received wine as part of their rations. Laborers drank it to dull exhaustion. Elites debated it with intellectual seriousness. Even children tasted diluted wine early, learning its place in society. To live in the Roman world was to live surrounded by wine. Rome did not invent wine, but it transformed it into an imperial system. Wherever Roman power expanded, vineyards followed. Veterans were settled on conquered land and encouraged to plant vines. Provinces were reshaped not only by roads and forts, but by cultivated hillsides. Wine became a marker of Roman presence. If wine was produced, Rome had arrived. Viticulture was treated as science. Roman writers recorded soil quality, sun exposure, pruning schedules, and harvest timing. Different grape varieties were matched to different climates. Failures were analyzed. Successes were copied. Wine was engineered, not left to chance. Wine also signaled status. Serving aged wine demonstrated wealth and patience. Cheap wine suggested carelessness or insult. Taste mattered deeply. Yet Romans emphasized control. Drinking wine undiluted was considered barbaric. Proper Romans mixed wine with water, balancing pleasure and restraint. Excess was feared and mocked, even if widely practiced. Vineyards demanded patience. Years passed before full production. Only stable regions could sustain that investment. This made viticulture a declaration of long-term control. Over time, provincial wines improved, challenging Italian dominance. Roman methods raised quality steadily. Harvest season was intense. Grapes were cut by hand, pressed quickly, and fermented naturally. Winemaking relied on experience rather than theory. Success brought prestige. Failure brought loss and shame. Storage followed. Amphorae shaped wine's aging, allowing slow transformation but unpredictable results. Resin seals influenced flavor. Roman wine tasted earthy, smoky, and medicinal by modern standards. Wine was flavored deliberately. Honey created balsam. Herbs, spices, and even seawater altered taste and preservation. Flavoring was not deception, it was skill. Wine was a base to be perfected through human intervention. This reflected Roman worldview. Civilization meant control over nature. Despite indulgence, Romans prized moderation. Drinking undiluted wine symbolized loss of reason. Dilution proved self-mastery. Banquets followed strict rituals. Toasts, conversation, and games imposed order. Wine loosened tongues, but rituals restrained chaos. Women faced stricter rules. Respectable women were expected to drink little. Stories of punishment reflected anxiety over independence. Yet hypocrisy was common. Roman literature is full of drunken elites. Rules existed because they were often broken. Wine also functioned as medicine. Doctors prescribed different wines for different ailments. Diluted wine improved digestion and circulation. Water alone was unsafe, making wine practical protection against disease. Excess, however, was dangerous. Wine was powerful medicine and moral test. As Roman power declined, wine endured. Vineyards outlived emperors. Christianity reshaped wine's meaning rather than rejecting it. Monasteries preserved viticultural knowledge. Roman techniques survived, shaping medieval and modern wine culture. Roman wine was rough and unpredictable, but its importance was unmatched. It shaped landscapes, economies, and identities. In mastering wine, Romans believed they mastered themselves, their land, and their empire. Long after Rome fell, its vineyards continued to produce, quietly preserving imperial legacy, one cup at a time.